Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 14 hidden gems for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be talking about players at a variety of different positions. But what they all have in common is the fact that they're all being started in less than 40% of leagues. Some players as low as 6%. So these are players that you would consider to be sleeper options. I like to call them hidden gems. These are players that are scattered across the entire fantasy football landscape. These are hidden gems that I like to go ahead and bring together in order to complete the fantasy football gauntlet, in order to help us capture a victory in Week 14. Because again, it's win or go home for many of us. We're trying to advance to our fantasy football playoffs in Week 15. So I'll mention these players, give you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also presenting statistics as to why I believe these are players that should be started in this week. And if in fact they're available in your leagues, pick them up and potentially play them. Before we get into today's content and talking about these potential prospects, let me give you guys a couple reminders. Down in the description of the video, there are timestamps. While you're down there, if you've yet to do so already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season, not only to help you get to the fantasy football playoffs, but capture a 2023 fantasy football championship. On top of it, again, tomorrow afternoon, 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I'll be live streaming here on the channel, and also 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time Sunday morning, I'll be live streaming here on the channel. For those of you who have questions in regards to your lineups, thank you very much. Also, at the end of today's episode, I'll be going ahead and putting together a couple pick'em slips via Underdog Fantasy. Again, our last two suggestions in terms of plays, Thursday's plays and Monday's plays, both hit. We're going to continue that momentum going into this weekend's games on Sunday. So be sure to go ahead and stick around for that. For those of you guys who want to go ahead, potentially follow and get my rankings every single Sunday for the remainder of the season, be sure to travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, you'll get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are for that singular week, by position, by tier, includes flex rankings for half and full PPR, all-encompassing rankings. I'll also be sending you those rankings Saturday of Week 15 and Saturday of Week 16 because there are Saturday games implicated there. So I'll make sure the rankings are in your inbox from my email directly to yours. So take advantage of the opportunity. Check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility going into, of course, the upcoming weekends. Sign up today using code Andrew. And if in fact you do so before Sunday's games, you can take advantage of 0.5 total yards via Dak Prescott for an overall free pick and play between the Dallas Cowboys and Philadelphia Eagles. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get into talking about my Week 14 hidden gems, beginning with our first player. We have Clyde Edwards-Helaire as the Soul Stone. And like we talk about every single week, and as we know, the Soul Stone requires a sacrifice. And the sacrifice is someone that we loved. Someone that I had ranked within my top 12 running backs going into this week. But unfortunately, Isaiah Pacheco popped up on the injury report, did not practice Wednesday, Thursday, and now on Friday, he has been deemed out for Week 14. Earlier today in a press conference, Andy Reid, of course, confirmed that Isaiah Pacheco was going to miss this week. And when asked about a potential IR stint, he said, "We'll see." And that doesn't give me much, hope for the potential of Isaiah Pacheco getting healthy sooner rather than later. And going forward, the expectation is that Clyde Edwards-Helaire is the next man up within this backfield. Of course, when Andy Reid earlier today in that press conference was also asked about the potential workload of CEH, especially considering Jerick McKinnon is coming off of an injury himself, he had gone ahead and publicly said that yes, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, CEH, is the RB1 of this offense. So going forward, we have the potential of picking up a player who's currently only being started in 8% of leagues. Now, this number has jumped a pretty high amount. It was as low as 2% this morning, has jumped to 8% on Yahoo as of today. Obviously, because many of us need to go ahead and start a running back because you're already dealing with bye weeks, and now Pacheco is out, you're dealing with injuries. Potentially, he is a starting option going into this week, taking on the Buffalo Bills. So let's go ahead and give you a little bit of context as to how well a guy like Clyde Edwards-Helaire can potentially play when given an opportunity. When I've looked at his entire career, 2020 through 2023, in the last 4 seasons, whenever Clyde Edwards-Helaire has been given 10 touches within a game, he's averaging 14.47 fantasy points per game. All you got to do is get him 10 plus touches, and he's going to be an active back. And of course, considering he's associated with an offense that continues to score at a high volume, of course, the expectation is fantasy points are going to be implicated within his overall performance going into this weekend. Now, when you go ahead and talk about games in which he has been given 10 rushing attempts or more, he's averaging 13.23 fantasy points per game. We know that not only is he a competent running back in terms of running the ball on the ground, but he can absolutely get it done through the air. That's exactly what he did at LSU prior to being drafted, and he's already gone ahead and throughout his career demonstrated that he can be a fantastic receiving back. But considering the fact that Jerick McKinnon will be active, we may not see as much of a higher potential role within the receiving game and on third downs because of Jerick McKinnon's overall presence. Now, when we go back to last season, 2022, from weeks 1 through 4, he was averaging 17.25 half PPR fantasy points per game. Throughout that span of time, those 4 weeks, he had 54 total touches. Again, not a high volume, but had scored 5 touchdowns. Touchdowns are always on the table for running backs. And considering someone like Isaiah Pacheco has scored 3 touchdowns within this backfield in just the last 2 weeks, playing himself 78 and 70% of the snaps in those last 2 games. I mean, even when you go back in the beginning of 2022, weeks 1 through 4, the guy was only playing 45% of the offensive snaps. So really, if you go ahead and give him the opportunity of getting 50+% of the snaps within this backfield, the expectation is that Clyde Edwards-Helaire should be a sufficient back to be able to start for us going into this week, especially considering the Kansas City Chiefs offense this season really has been emphasizing running the ball. Thus far this season, they're averaging 19 running back rushing attempts per game, 230 total this season from their running backs. In the last 4 games, they've had totals of 18, 22, 18, and 22 rushing attempts. So at a base minimum, 18 rushing attempts should be in line going against the Buffalo Bills this upcoming week. A defense that over the course of the season has struggled in terms of stopping the run based on the injuries that they have accumulated over the course of the season. From weeks 1 through 12, the Buffalo Bills have been allowing 11.8 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. That's rushing yards and rushing touchdowns, and a 4.6 yard per carry average. So thus far this season, the Buffalo Bills are allowing 19 running back rushing attempts per game for 88 rushing yards and a half a rushing touchdown per game. That doesn't even include the potential receiving statistics that Clyde Edwards-Helaire can go ahead and accumulate within this given game. And on top of it, any sort of statistics that Jerick McKinnon can compile within the receiving game. Overall, I think this is a fantastic play. Obviously, in comparison to Isaiah Pacheco, Clyde Edwards-Helaire is a lesser back, but when given opportunity, he can absolutely succeed for fantasy purposes, and I'm expecting him to do so within the matchup going into this week. Now, I want to continue to talk about this Kansas City Chiefs backfield, talking about the reality of the situation with the reality stone, talking about Jerick McKinnon, the thumbnail of today's episode. I truly do believe that both of these running backs can be starting options. Now, if you were to ask me between these 2 running backs, which one I prefer, I would tell you that going into this week, I prefer Clyde Edwards-Helaire, primarily because Jerick McKinnon is coming off an injury, and there were some conversations of him being potentially limited within the overall game. That being said, we talked about, a guy like Devon Achane, Raheem Mostert last week. We thought, Devon Achane would be potentially limited within his overall workload. Obviously, he had 20 plus fantasy points in just the second half alone. Nonetheless, it's a little bit of a different overall dynamic and scenario considering that was a blowout. And this is a backfield where we have 2 running backs who will be contributing for the entirety of the game. Nonetheless, I do believe currently within the reality of the situation with Isaiah Pacheco out and Jerick McKinnon returning from injury, a player that is currently only being started in 6% of leagues, he has the potential to provide a lot of fantasy upside. I mean, last season, throughout the fantasy football playoffs, he was a fantasy team saver. He was a darling who absolutely captured many fantasy football championships with his overall efforts. Let's just go ahead and put this into perspective. Last season, from weeks 1 through 11, Clyde Edwards-Helaire was healthy. Unfortunately, what Clyde Edwards-Helaire has had to deal with throughout his entire career is a boatload of injuries. So last season, after week 11, injured, was sent to the injured reserve. While Clyde Edwards-Helaire was active, Jerick McKinnon was only averaging 5.2 half PPR fantasy points per game throughout 2022. Now, if you go ahead and look at weeks 13 through 18 in the absence of CEH, Jerick McKinnon throughout that span of time, averaging 18.52 fantasy points per game, was one of the best fantasy running backs throughout that span of time and was getting majority of his production through the air. If you go ahead and just put this in perspective, from weeks 13 through 18 of the 2022 season, 6 games, he had 31 overall targets, 27 receptions, 274 receiving yards, and 8 receiving touchdowns in just 6 games. 7 of those 8 overall receiving touchdowns within the red zone. Besides Travis Kelce, the Kansas City Chiefs established late last season that Jerick McKinnon was going to be a red zone threat. And he's already established that this season. Quietly, he has already scored 3 receiving touchdowns, and a lot of them in the red zone. So if in fact we're going to be in a situation once again in which Jerick McKinnon, healthy, is going to be the primary receiving back of this team, of course, he could very easily have himself a receiving touchdown or even more. Even though thus far this season, the most rushing attempts he has had within a singular game is only 3, and he is not going to be implicated as someone that is going to get himself 10 plus rushing attempts. Majority of the attempts are going to go in the direction of Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Who's to say that Jerick McKinnon can't come away with a performance of 4 to 6 receptions, 40 to 60 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown to make his entire week? Because that's exactly what he was able to accomplish late last season in order to help our fantasy teams. And why not once again this season in order to elevate us to the playoffs and potentially help us capture a fantasy football championship? Because the reality of the situation is, without Isaiah Pacheco active, both of these running backs have immense value and can be fantasy relevant not only in week 14, but beyond. All right, moving on to the power stone for this week. we have Keaton Mitchell of the Baltimore Ravens. Now, on multiple occasions over the course of the last month, we have heard John Harbaugh, the head coach of the Baltimore Ravens, come out and say, yes, we want to get Keaton Mitchell more opportunities, and they have been trending in that direction. Last time out against the Los Angeles Chargers in Week 12, we saw Keaton Mitchell put up a 46% offensive snap share. That was a season high, and of course, he had more overall offensive snaps than Gus Edwards. This wasn't a positive game script game. It was rather a close contest in which they preferred to utilize more Keaton Mitchell than Gus Edwards. Not only that, within that same game, Keaton Mitchell had 11 total touches. That was more than Gus Edwards. We are trending in a direction in which Keaton Mitchell is eventually going to take over this backfield, and why not this week? I mean, just looking at weeks 9 through 12, in which Keaton Mitchell has come back healthy and active, he has a 9.3 yard per attempt average in 4 games. He has 29 attempts and only 6 targets. So again, not a lot of overall opportunity, but when he's given opportunity, he has been extremely efficient. Not only does he average 9.3 yards per attempt, he has a 7.48 yards after contact per attempt average. So not only is he making first contact, but blowing right through it and making incredible plays on a consistent basis. Thus far this season, on his 29 overall rushing attempts, 7 of them have consisted of 10 or more yards. So 25% of the time, he's getting a first down guarantee, just 10 yards or more. Again, he's putting up incredible performances, and he has shown himself to be an explosive playmaker within this backfield. Over the course of the last 4 games, he's been able to get himself a share of 34% of the running back rushing attempts, 53% of the running back rushing yards, 60% of the running back targets, and 44% of the running back fantasy points in a half PPR over the course of weeks 9 through 12. He's getting himself far more opportunity, and as that continues to progress, not only can he go ahead and make plays out of the backfield on the ground, but he's been, lined up in the slot position. He's been lined up in the inline. He's been lined up out wide at times and been given end zone targets. He's a dynamic player that is going to be a huge option for this offense going forward, and especially coming off of the bye week, I think that they're going to now unleash Keaton Mitchell upon the Los Angeles Rams. The Ravens are a 7.5 point favorite within this game and are the home team. Thus far this season, the Baltimore Ravens as a team are averaging over 30 points per game at home. Not only that, the Los Angeles Rams since week 5 are allowing 11.04 fantasy points per game on average in terms of rushing statistics to opposing running backs. That's rushing yards and rushing touchdowns, and also allowing 4.14 yards per carry. So if in fact the game script positions itself to where the Baltimore Ravens have a lead, they're dominating in the second half of this game, and they continue to give the ball in the direction of Keaton Mitchell, we could very easily see a second half very reminiscent of what we saw last week from Devon Achane. The potential is there, the explosivity is there, and the playmaking ability is always on the table, especially behind this offensive line for the Baltimore Ravens. I'm expecting a solid week here from Keaton Mitchell, a week that is going to give him enough momentum for the remainder of the season to be a fantasy, playoff darling that maybe ends up helping us win a championship. All right, moving on. Let's talk about the Space Stone for this week. We have Romeo Doubs. Earlier today, we were given confirmation that once again, Christian Watson has not practiced. Now, I understand they play on Monday night, so there is a potential in which tomorrow he could get a limited practice, and by the time we get to Monday Night Football, he could be an active participant. But my assumption is that considering Christian Watson has already dealt with a hamstring injury earlier this season, an injury that made him miss weeks 1 through 3, there is a potential in which, of course, Romeo Doubs, in the absence of Christian Watson, could have himself in another explosive performance. Now, when we go back to weeks 1 through 4, in which Christian Watson was either out or limited, we saw throughout that span of time, weeks 1 through 4, Romeo Doubs averaging 8.25 targets, 5.0 receptions, 56 receiving yards per game, 0.75 receiving touchdowns, 3 touchdowns in those 4 games that he played, and averaging 12.6 half PPR fantasy points per game. He had himself incredible performances in the absence of Christian Watson, and that's what I'm anticipating to see this week. A player that is currently only started in 22% of leagues taking on a defense like the New York Giants. I would expect that the Green Bay Packers, considering how well they have played as of late, especially a player like Jordan Love, to continue their success. Now, thus far this season, when Romeo Doubs with Jordan Love has been given an ample set of opportunity, and I'm not asking for like 8+ targets, I'm talking about 5+ targets. In the 8 games in which he's been given 5 or more targets, he's been able to put up 9 or more fantasy points in a half PPR in every single game. Throughout those 8 games, he's averaging 12.5 fantasy points per game and has scored 7 touchdowns in those 8 games. We know that Romeo Doubs is a huge part of this offense, but especially in the absence of Christian Watson. If by the time we get to Monday Night Football, again, many of us are in a situation in which we don't know whether or not Christian Watson is going to be active. If we don't get good news tomorrow in terms of his hamstring injury and his practice participation, I'm firing up Romeo Doubs for Monday night against the New York Giants. An offense for the Green Bay Packers who, yes, Even though earlier this season, I used to clown them for being the worst offense in the National Football League in the first half. They were literally dead last in terms of total points per game on average in the first half. As of late, we have seen a paradigm shift to where their team in the first half of games over the course of the last 3 weeks are averaging 15.7 points per game. As long as they continue to play well in the first half, of course, the sky's the limit for someone like Romeo Doubs. Let's move on to the time zone for this week. We have Chris Godwin, wide receiver of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Like I said earlier this week, in which I was talking about my wide receiver rankings on Wednesday, I talked about Chris Godwin and the potential of him getting more opportunity, considering not only did the offensive coordinator, but of course the head coach. So Dave Canales, the offensive coordinator, head coach Todd Bowles, have both come out over the course of the last 2 weeks in press conferences and said publicly that we want to get the ball to Chris Godwin more often going forward. And by making public proclamations that you're going to get this guy the ball, my assumption would be that yes, they're looking in the direction of getting Chris Godwin the ball far more often going forward, especially considering on the opposite side of the field, Mike Evans is tearing it up every single week. I think there's a lot of potential in which Mike Evans, who's going to pull double coverage, is going to help open up Chris Godwin going forward. He's a wide receiver who's currently only being started in 37% of leagues going into week 14. And I understand why that number is so low. It's because he really hasn't played very well this season in comparison to last year. When you go look at the 2022 statistics of Chris Godwin, in 13 of the 15 games he played, he had 6 or more receptions. Thus far this season, he only has 6 or more receptions in 4 of the 12 games he has played. A huge difference from going from someone like Tom Brady, who loves to check it down to his slot receiver, in comparison to Baker Mayfield, and now Chris Godwin being forced to play on the outside as an outside receiving option rather than a primary slot receiving option. Now, luckily this week, they take on the Atlanta Falcons. Last time out against the Atlanta Falcons, Chris Godwin had 12 targets, 6 receptions, 66 receiving yards, 9.6 half PPR fantasy points. That was a season high in terms of total targets, and this team had identified a mismatch in order to give Chris Godwin that high level of opportunity. So my assumption is going into this week's matchup against the Atlanta Falcons, they're going to continue to try to key in on that matchup. If they line up in the slot position more often this week, which of course would be optimal for their overall scenario, considering D. Alford, the primary nickel cornerback of the Atlanta Falcons, one of the worst in the National Football League in terms of giving up the most yardage and of course receptions to opposing slot receiving options. If they allow Chris Godwin to get that level of opportunity, which I'm expecting to be the case, he should go ahead and put together another big performance. Now, last week, even though he had himself 3 targets, 0 catches, luckily was able to get himself a rushing attempt on an end around that scored him a 19-yard rushing touchdown. Fantastic. When you give this guy the ball, he's a playmaker. He has proven that over the course of his entire career, he can be fantasy relevant. I'm expecting this week, especially considering the fact that all of the coaching staff are on the same page. Let's get him the ball. I'm expecting him to be a fantastic option this week because it's finally time for Chris Godwin to put together some solid fantasy performances for our teams. Let's move on to the final option, the Mind Stone. Last week, we had the Atlanta Falcons as a potential play. They dominated against the New York Jets. We're continuing on. The Mind Stone leads us towards playing whichever defense is taking on the Jets every single week. And I understand that Tim Boyle has been relieved of his duties, and now that they have Zach Wilson as a starting quarterback, their offense should be a little bit better. But let's just put this into perspective. In the last 2 games, the Jets offense with Tim Boyle, the defenses in which have taken on their offense for fantasy purposes scored 17 and 21 points. If you go ahead and compare that to the 4 last games in which Zach Wilson was the starting quarterback of this team, where he wasn't relieved of his duties midway through that game, I'm not even going to count the Buffalo Bills matchup. In the 4 other games in which Zach Wilson was the outright starter from beginning to end, defenses against that team, 12, 27, 8, and 21. There is a lot of potential in which you can fire up this Texans defense, which are great in terms of stopping the run, are great in terms of pass rush, and absolutely can force turnovers at the quarterback position. Again, they just picked off Russell Wilson 3 times last week. I would anticipate to see a huge performance here from the Houston Texans, a defense that is not only going to be relevant this week, but going forward in future weeks as their fantasy playoff schedule is primed. Now that I've gone ahead and collected these 6 hidden gems for week 14 and completed the fantasy football gauntlet, let's go ahead and let's transition into talking about some pick'ems via Underdog Fantasy going into week 14, continuing the hot streak from Thursday and Monday right now. So over the course of the last 3 videos that I posted here on the channel, in which I've made pick'em slip suggestions, this is how I have gone as of late. Yesterday, my primary play at the end of the video was Deontay Johnson receiving yards. That hit. Monday night, my 2 primary plays were Calvin Ridley targets. That hit. And Travis Etienne anytime touchdown. That also hit. Then we had last week's Hidden Gems video, where Jerome Ford receptions hit, Najee Harris rushing yards hit, Michael Pittman Jr. receptions hit, and David Montgomery anytime touchdown hit. So over the course of that span of time, 7 of the plays hit. Unfortunately, last week, I messed around and I thought that Sam Howell, who was on a consistent streak of throwing 40 plus attempts per game, ended up with 23 rushing attempts against the Miami Dolphins. Of course, because the Miami Dolphins were so successful in the second half running the ball, there was no time left for Sam Howell to throw the ball. So Sam Howell missed in terms of his overall passing attempts, and David Njoku in last week's Hidden Gems episode in terms of receptions, receiving yards, also missed. So as of the last 9 suggestions, 7 have hit, 2 have missed. Let's go ahead and let's try to get 5 of 5 going into Sunday's slate of games. So let's go ahead and begin where we left off last week, picking Michael Pittman Jr. going higher on his overall receptions. I have hit this, I think, on 4 consecutive games. He continues to be able to deliver, considering he has gone higher than 7 receptions in 7 of the last 8 games. In fact, he's gotten himself 8 receptions in 7 of the last 8 games in which Gardner Minshew has been the starting quarterback. Worst case scenario, he gets 7 receptions and the overall play still hits at the end of the day. I'm expecting Michael Pittman Jr. going up against the Cincinnati Bengals to put up a great performance in this circumstance. The next player I wanted to mention is someone that we have talked about in weeks past and has hit on many of overall pick'em slips, Garrett Wilson. I wanted to talk about his overall receiving yard total. It is now down to 54.5. It was actually low. It was actually higher earlier today. I think it was at 56.5 when I was kind of preparing the overall notes for this overall regard. In terms of 54.5 receiving yards, he has been able to hit this in 5 of the last 6 games he has played with Zach Wilson. One of those overall games, the one that is missed in this overall circumstance, he had 54 receiving yards. So literally 1 yard away from 6 of the last 6 games in which he has started with Zach Wilson playing the full game from beginning to end. He's been able to go higher on this overall number. I'm taking that with Garrett Wilson going up against this weekend's matchup versus the Houston Texans secondary, which in my opinion can be taken advantage of. The next play that I like is DJ Moore. He continues to deliver for fantasy purposes, and especially for, of course, Underdog Pick'em's plays. I'm going to go ahead and take higher on his overall receiving yard total. Like I've mentioned on multiple occasions, in the last 6 games in which DJ Moore has played with Justin Fields, he's been able to surpass this number and go 96 yards or more in 5 of the last 6 games. In fact, the last time out against the Detroit Lions, who he has the privilege of taking on this week, he went for 96 receiving yards. My expectation, he should be able to very easily surpass this number of 70.5 receiving yards. Now, we've talked about a couple wide receivers. Let's talk about a running back. Josh Jacobs, over the course of the last couple weeks, now that we have seen the firing of Josh McDaniels, has been a huge part of this offense in terms of overall rushing attempts. In fact, in 3 of the last 4 games he has played, he has had himself 20, 27, and 26 rushing attempts. We have seen Antonio Pierce, the head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders, in his public overall statements with the press, say on multiple occasions, what I feel most comfortable with is when we can get Josh Jacobs the ball on the ground 20 plus times. Literally, that was his words. You can go and find the quote. It is ridiculous. I think 18.5 rushing attempts is not enough. I'm expecting him to get to his sweet number of 20 rushing attempts going into the matchup. I expect this to be a close game between these two teams. And even in a negative game script, they're going to run the ball with Josh Jacobs and they're going to continue to find success. I expect this number to be very easily achieved by Josh Jacobs this week. Let's go ahead and close out with the final player, CeeDee Lamb. Taking on the Philadelphia Eagles this week is one of the easiest matchups you can possibly ask for. Back in week 9 in the matchup, 11 receptions, 191 receiving yards. And for some reason, they have his number at 90.5. So they think he's going to have 100 less receiving yards than he did the last time out against his team. I'm expecting him to surpass this number. He's been able to go higher than 116 receiving yards in 5 of the last 7 games. This is a defense that cannot stop opposing wide receivers. These are 5 overall plays that I love going into this week. Again, CeeDee Lamb, Josh Jacobs, DJ Moore, Garrett Wilson, Michael Pittman Jr. I'll have more plays Saturday afternoon during a live stream and perhaps on Sunday morning. But I honestly do believe that these are 5 incredible plays. You can put them all together. You can put an insurance slip on it. You can go ahead and branch them out like Josh Jacobs with CeeDee Lamb, Michael Pittman Jr. with DJ Moore. Spread them out. Sprinkle a little bit on all of them. But those are my favorite plays going into week 14. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's content. If, in fact, you did, be sure to go ahead, click the like button down below. Subscribe if you haven't yet already. I'll be back tomorrow, again, 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, live streaming here on the channel. Hope to see you there. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.